focusing in on the whole concept of mental literacy and the increasingly popular notions of the left and right brain. What exactly was the research in the field? What does it mean now? And what are its implications for the future and for genius?
Well, give me a few days and I'll... No, in fact, what I'll do, as I said, is take you on a Concorde flight over this basically 40-year research period and tell you what happened, what some of the misconceptions are, and what the implications are for the future, and especially, obviously, for genius.
This is all left and right brain?
This is all left and right brain.
Have I got two brains here?
You actually don't. You have multiple brains, and I'll get into that in considerable detail. What you actually have is a massive cortex that is the upper part of the brain. It's the evolutionarily most advanced part of the brain.
That's what makes us what we are?
Yeah, precisely. It is the, if you like, the thinking cap. Lorraine Gill, the artist, called it the thinking cap.
Ah.
Very nice. So you have the spine, and then on top of that you have the earlier parts of the brain that deal with various motor functions and so on. And then on top of that, this cerebral cortex, the thinking cap, that is divided into two halves. So what we're really talking here about is not the left and right side of the brain, but the left and right side of the top part of the brain. And the research into this began basically in the 1950s and 1960s with Roger Sperry, Professor Roger Sperry of California. And he actually won the Nobel Prize for this very series of experiments. And what he did was really exciting. They just at that time begun to realize that the brain gave off brain waves. So when people have been saying, I've had a brain wave, it was actually true.
So brain waves really exist?
They really exist.
So when you see Star Trek with the giant panel and the little colour balls going up and down, boom, 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 there are actually brain waves being measured?
Yes, there are.
That's real and genuine?
Yeah, and Roger Sperry was one of the first to do that. The experiment that he did was to put an electroencephalogrammic cap. That's a plastic cap with lots of wires coming off it, all attached to printing readouts that show which brainwaves are coming off. And he said to people, read this poetry, solve this mathematical dilemma, have a little daydream, talk to somebody about so-and-so, analyze this. And so he gave them different intellectual tasks, and he was expecting the brain to give off different brainwaves for various kinds of tasks, which indeed it did. But what he didn't expect was that the two hemispheres would divide the tasks between them so that the left was dominant in one series of arenas and the right was dominant in the other.
Is that what happened?
That's actually what happened. And that was this, extraordinary, unexpected result that led to all that we now know about the left and right sides of the cortex. Because what actually the result initially indicated was that the left hemisphere, the left side of the upper part of the brain, was dominant in the fields of logic, lists, lines, words, numbers, and analysis.
So that's all the normal academic topics?
Yes. They label them the academic, the intellectual, the professional, the business type of skills. Now, while that was going on, the right side of the cortex tended to be in
was having a good time?
Yeah. Well, having a rest, basically. And the right side of the cortex, however, became very active, and the left went into its more resting state when it had to deal with things like rhythm, with colour, with imagination. Notice imagination.
Imagination.
Yes.
Pictures.
Imagination is the ability of the brain to engineer images.
Yes.
Daydreaming was another right hemisphere ability. And it's interesting that we now know that you have to daydream, basically, or you go insane and die.
Yeah.
So if anybody ever finds you with your feet up in your office or school or at home and they accuse you of inappropriate or unprofessional behaviour, you can just open one eye as you're drifting off and say, survival training.
Yeah.
Because it's really important, and we all daydream. And daydreaming is the brain's necessary workout of images, allowing us to create the visions which lead us through our lives and towards and on the path of genius. Another thing that the right hemisphere was dominant in was spatial awareness and seeing kind of the global, the whole picture. Now, at that time, in the 1950s and 60s, those skills were called the creative, the artistic, the emotional, and so on. What then happened in the beginning of the 1970s was people like myself and many others said, well, what happens if we take people who are weak in certain areas, say they're weak in mathematics or they're weak in art or they're weak in rhythm, and we train them to become stronger in their weakness. And the most extraordinary results happen. We found that training a person in the weakness resulted in an enormous expansion of the strengths in many of the other areas. So that by training a weakness, the person's memory might improve by 3, 5, 10 times. That by training in imagination and rhythm, interestingly, their verbal and literary skills also began to increase. And that seemed to make sense because what was obviously going on was that the two sides of the upper part of the brain were having conversations with each other. So a bit of information would come in which was mathematical,
Yes.
and it would be sent across the corpus callosum, which is this fabulously intricate passageway between the two sides of the brain, millions and millions of brain cells shuttling information back and forward. So mathematical numbers and so on would go over to the right hemisphere, which would process them and send them back with a bit more color and space added, and then the left hemisphere would say, oh, thanks for that. Here it comes back with some more logic and words addended. And so it shuttled back and forward, building up this conversation within the brain between itself and itself. And creativity and memory and all these things expanded. So everybody said, well, that's wonderful. And then started the big debate. And interestingly and appropriately, it was on the geniuses. People said, this can't really be true. Because if it were true, then the great academics, the great scientists would have been dominant in the right hemisphere as well, but they obviously weren't. The mathematicians and the professionals and the business people were all left dominant. And the artists and the creative people were all right dominant. And that in the 1970s was the beginning of my next major stage in the studying of the geniuses. Because the question was, well, how could that be? How could all the great geniuses be one-sided or the other-sided? And yet the brain research showed that the brain seemed to work best when both sides were working in harmony. And that inspired me to study even further the geniuses. And of course, as we began to realize, all this division was totally incorrect.
Yes.
And still, in the same way that Muhammad Ali was able to kind of give people a picture of himself to his own advantage, so we have this picture of left and right brained, which actually isn't true. These images we have of the prodigy as this bent
Yes.
antisocial, of the creative individual as having no memory and being scruffy and being basically unclean, and of the athlete as being thick. These are obviously now under major question.
Right.
Because what the research was suggesting was that another picture was probably true. Now, if you think of the 10 geniuses we've just gone through, and you think, well, now, was Einstein
Left brain or
left
right
side dominant?
Yes.
Well, now, hold on a minute. He played the violin.
Daydreamed.
He daydreamed. He played imagination games. He drifted around in yachts.
He must have been right side dominant.
Yes, except that he also played with numbers, was unbelievably logical, made things equal to other things. So Einstein obviously was using his entire cortex. In this research, we then went over to the artists. Now, the assumption had been that the artists would be totally right dominant. And so you'd look into their diaries and you'd find things like, up at about 12 o'clock today and had a bit of this and drank a bit of that and, splashed the paint around on the canvas for a bit and then went out and partied all night. Nothing like it. You read the diaries of Paul Klee, of Cézanne, of the Lorraine Gills, and it's things like up at 7 in the morning to work on painting number 5, series number 3, on the problem of translating sound into vision. Mix so many parts of this colour with so many parts of that, which I placed at this junction on the canvas, so as to act in visual opposition with this colour combination at this junction of the canvas in order to produce the following effect in the perceiver.
Science of art again.
Yeah, pure. So the scientists were using the whole cortex, the artists were using the whole cortex, and we suddenly came up with this amazing discovery in the last year, and that is that the brain is actually connected to the body. And that all our misconceptions were unbelievable misconceptions. I mean, people have been assuming that to be creative, all you had to do was hang around on street corners, get scruffy, lose your memory, become disorganized and say, whoa, wow, there's an amazing idea. Oh, I can't put it in words. It's a strange inspiration. Yeah, oh, I'm so creative. Now, that is a complete misunderstanding of what genius and what creativity is. And if you believe that the artistic and the creative are only rhythm, color, daydreaming, imagination, and spatial awareness, you miss what is becoming increasingly apparent in the studies of the geniuses, that all these skills have to work together. I mean, think of Alexander. Totally left, 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 and totally right, 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 right. Think of Elizabeth. Right, 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 right. All that fashion and design and colour and rhythm and music, and total logic, total mathematics, total analysis.
Calculation, everything.
Yeah. Muhammad Ali, the same. Words, words, words. Number, calculation, prediction, analysis. Round four. Precisely. So we began to realize in the 1980s that genius, that intelligence, that artisticness, creativity, academia, the professions, were not left or right, but were total. The entire cortex really being used in harmony with itself. And what is, again, interesting is that without, in a sense, them knowing what they were really doing in terms of cortical skills, all the genius latched on to the fact that what they needed to do to get to that vision was use the entire arsenal of their mental weaponry, to use all the skills available to them in concert towards that particular vision.
That's right. That's why you see so many of them, especially Leonardo, for example, talking about association, that each idea associates with something else.
Yeah,
and
precisely.
brings in everything.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, Da Vinci is, if you like, the ultimate example of the user of cortical skills.
Yes.
If you look at his scientific notebooks, what are they all filled with?
Well, it's not hanging out and smoking joints, is it?
No, it's actually words and numbers
Yes.
and images
Yes,
and colours.
they're the most comprehensive set of notes ever taken by anyone anywhere.
Extraordinary. And they combine all the intellectual skills. And you look at his paintings, these glorious, colourful, spatial masterpieces, but then you go back one step and you look at him organising the painting.
On a mathematical basis.
And it was purely mathematical.
Yes.
It was architectural, lines, numbers, planning where the members of the Last Supper would be sitting, how they related to windows, ceilings, walls, tables,
Yes.
fruit, all mathematically worked out.
Architectonic.
Yeah, precisely.
So where does this leave Sperry's research? And why did he come to this conclusion that there was a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and one was dominant and one wasn't dominant?
Because there actually was in the experiments.
Yes.
Now, the next stage of the research, after the people had been trained in areas where they were weak, showed that the really good thinkers, right, the people who were brilliant writers, when they were being analysed on the electroencephalogram, when they were writing, the whole of the brain was active.
So it's like a car with four wheels, and let's say that one wheel has fallen off,
Yes.
so the car is limping along. You cure that wheel, and then both sides of the car are moving perfectly and travelling at the correct speed in the right direction.
Perfect. So all the great thinkers, whether or not they were in mathematics or science or music or art or military or planning of any sort, when they were analysed on the electroencephalogram, showed that all these
Four wheels.
skills and all four wheels, both sides of the cortex, were operating in harmony with each other. So what Sperry had probably been measuring was the way in which we trained ourselves to be lopsided. For example, we had thought that number was purely grey, linear, boring logic.
Whereas in fact, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Leonardo, all based on numbers.
Precisely. I mean, music is numerical.
Yeah.
And the great memorizers, interestingly, saw numbers in colours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
They saw numbers in
they saw
colours.
numbers in colours, and so you'd say to them, tell me about the number 7. Instead of saying, well, it comes after 6 and before 8, and if you multiply it by itself, it's 49.
Brilliant flaming orange colour.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. I mean, they could taste them. They got all their senses involved.
They could taste the numbers too.
Yeah, so that their senses began to interlink with each other, again coming back to Da Vinci. So what this research then led us to realize was that all these cortical skills are simply there waiting to be developed, and it needs the right environment in which they can develop. And then you start to think about those skills in relation to the multiple intelligences, the verbal, the numerical, the engineering spatial, the creative, imaginative daydreaming, the interpersonal, verbal, rhythm, spatial, the intrapersonal, the space of internal dialogue, the sensual, the body and kinesthetic, the spiritual, this, if you like, the giant internal space and all that it contains, and then the genius formula, you suddenly see
Wraps them all up.
it wraps them all up and reflects exactly as it must do and should do and delightfully does exactly the set of skills that the upper cortex has. So then we say, well, if that's what the geniuses did, how is our normal educational system and our approach to ourselves either hindering or helping the pursuit and the unleashing of our natural genius? And we go back to our own time in school. I mean, if we think between the age of, say, 5 and 18, to be good in school, to be a good student, what 3 main things do we have to be good at?
Reading, writing, arithmetic.
Precisely, which is left dominant, left dominant, left dominant. Now, if you're a little 5-year-old child and you kind of leap into school on your first day and you're enthusiastic and you demonstrate that you're tremendous at kind of drumming out rhythms on the desk and the floor, that you're great at making imaginative comments in the class, you love the playground and you're good at throwing balls around and running about and keeping active, you're all enthusiastic about colours and you get them all over your face and clothes and so on, you love food and you play with it with your hands and get it all over your face, etc., and you're top of your little class in daydreaming, what names are you called? What labels are you given? What quote-unquote positive inputs
That's
come
right.
into your little brain about who you are? I mean, what do they say?
Dozy, naughty, inattentive.
Wicked,
Yeah.
delinquent, not ready for education, subnormal, dunce, hyperactive, suffering from attention deficit disability syndrome. I mean, put in a corner, when in fact what that child is demonstrating, as we can now increasingly see, is half the formula
For genius.
for genius. And that should be encouraged.
Yes.
Obviously channeled appropriately, but encouraged. So we've tended to make ourselves tremendously lopsided.
It's a shibboleth.
That's right. I mean, it's a destruction.
Yes, it's a shibboleth of the left side.
Yeah, precisely. And we need to make sure that from now on we allow the comprehensive nature. In the development of genius, what's happened is people have gone academic in terms of the old sense of that word, saying reading, writing, arithmetic, that's what it's all about. And then they said, well, no, it really should be about imagery and creativity and music. And then that doesn't quite work. So they, I mean, from the traditional reading, writing, arithmetic, you get a group of graduates who are very literate and very numerous, and they're antisocial and uncreative and can't solve imaginative problems, don't sing, don't dance, don't paint. And people say, well, this is no good. So they say, get rid of that old stuff and let's bring in painting and art and music and creativity and self-expression. So you get all these wonderful people doing all that stuff who are illiterate, innumerate, disorganized, confused, and unbalanced.
Yes.
So what the genius formula says is you must combine all those skills, and whatever you are doing now in relation to those, have a look at what you do, examine it, see where your strengths are, see where your weaknesses are, and then develop the weaknesses into greater strengths and continue to develop the strengths.
It's what Ueshiba said, the harmony in the universe.
Yeah, precisely.
Be in tune with it.
And it's interesting that the babies, you come back to the baby, and if you ask parents, and again, listeners can ask themselves, what side of the baby's brain develops first and fastest? Now, nearly everybody says the right side.
Of course they would.
Yeah. Now, if you think about a 2-month-old baby and you give it a piece of paper, within no time at all, it's kind of... And
There you are, it's rhythm,
and then it shows it to people around.
Yeah, making a sound.
It looks and kind of displays it to everybody. And then it does this and sees if it can tear it. And then it sticks it into its mouth and spits it out. And then tries the musical instruments again. Now, people just think that's a baby mucking around with a piece of paper. What, in fact, it is a total little Isaac Newton, Leonardo da Vinci experimenting. Bang, 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 bang. Rhythm, what kind of musical instruments can I make with this material? Show it to other people. Psychology, sociology, economics. How many people are interested in this? Anybody wants some of this stuff? How much are you willing to pay for it? And then check the engineering, mechanical, tensile strength of the material, and then stick it in the chemical, billion-faceted laboratory not so good. And then check the musical instruments again, and then move on to the next experiment in this infinitely fascinating, infinitely interconnected universe. Using what side of my little cortex? Both. Total analysis, total rhythm, total awareness, total logic, total exchange, total spatial awareness. Astounding ability. And at the same time that the baby has this whole cortex being used, its body is already developing. At the age of 1 day, you ask people, how strong is it? Terribly weak. How coordinated? Totally uncoordinated. Again, two absolute misconceptions. If you put a rope across a little baby, and it can grab it with its hands and its feet, you can lift that rope, and guess what happens?
Baby goes up.
Baby hangs on.
Yes.
Now, I mean, any of our listeners can try. You try to do that.
Yeah, I've tried that.
Yeah. And if you put a baby at 1 day old into a large warm pool, guess what it does?
It'll swim.
It swims. Very coordinated. And then what do? Right? We take this unbelievable little Da Vinci, its whole cortex going, all its senses going, its body already amazingly coordinated and strong, and we take it out to explore the third planet from the sun, our Earth. And what do? First of all, we dress it up. We put great big no-toed shoes on it, and then big trousers, which come up over hip-locking nappers and diapers. And then we put on a big thick shirt and a big woolly pullover, and then one of these giant puffy space jackets, which have gloves that are attached with no fingers. And then we put a big hood which comes up over the hearing apparatus and down and crushes the visual apparatus. And then we lie them down in the pram or the baby buggy, this 4-wheeled device for transporting little geniuses. And then we think, oh, danger, they could fall out. So we get a giant strap and we strap them down by the gut. And if you've got a really expensive pram, you can get 2 straps and you get them down by the chest as well. And then we think, oh, further danger, light might damage the eyes. So over them we put this giant hood, early training in tunnel vision. And then we think, oh, Da Vinci said, develop all the senses. So we hang on the hood little dingling bells, dingle 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 dingle. And then we think, oh, better develop their linguistic and oral and verbal intelligences. So into their mouth, we put a pacifier. Then we think, oh, better develop the visual senses. So from the roof of this little pram, we hang a piece of string, and onto it we attach a little plastic or furry toy which swings back and forward, back and forward, ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. And then we wonder where all the geniuses have gone. And of course what we've actually done is trap ourselves when we were babies, we've lopsided ourselves when we were in school, and we've put ourselves in this metaphorical pram where all our genius is strapped in, held down, blocked, stopped, interfered with. And what all the modern research is showing is that it's very easy to get out of the pram. And you do it simply by exploring how the great geniuses did it, exploring what those main characteristics were, and starting off on this wonderful exploration of mental literacy, learning about the alphabet of the brain. And what this left and right hemisphere research shows is that there's a lot more in terms of the range of skills, that everybody has a much greater power and energy and potential in each one of those, and that the more they are used, the more each one of them supports, enhances, and strengthens the other. So you get this build up and build up and build up, and then it becomes very easy to see how relatively easy it is to move into the unleashing of your own genius. It's simply using what you've got in the appropriate way.
That concludes the first part of the mental literacy physical alphabet of the brain. Is there anything else we need to know about the actual physics of the brain if we're going to develop and unleash our own genius?
Yes, there is, and it's the fundamental operating unit of the brain, and that is the brain cell. And normally people think, oh, brain cells are the things that die and drop off. Now, in fact, the brain cell is, if you like, the forefront of modern brain research, and it's producing this astounding array, this cascade of marvelous news about who we are. I mean, because of this research, statistics about how much we think we use of our abilities are changing rapidly. In the 1950s, people said, we only seem to be using about 50% of our genius, of our potential. And then in the 1960s, they were saying, well, it seems as if we're only using about 40%. By the 1970s, it had gone down to, well, maybe only 30%. By the 80s, they were saying perhaps 10 to 20%. In the 90s, we can guarantee you that it's less than 1% in the areas of memory, creativity, general association of ideas, mind mapping, learning, and so on, which we're going to be dealing with shortly. But we can prove that literally statistically. And the whole basis comes down to the brain cell and what it can do. First of all, the brain cell is like this wonderful, multi-tentacled, little beautiful octopus. And we have in our head, that's every human brain, has 1 million brain cells. 1 million brain cells. That's 1 followed by 12 noughts. It's an enormous number. What is more interesting than that, however, is what can each one of these things do? Now, the more they've investigated, they found out simple little things like each one of these million brain cells has the entire coded genetic message to reproduce completely the human being in whose brain that brain cell is. That's in each one of those brain cells, the entire blueprint for that person. I mean, staggering capacity.
That's incredible.
And that's just one of the things it can do. It's been estimated that each one of those brain cells is far more powerful than the standard PC computer. And we've got 1 million. Now, just to give you some idea of the power of it, you think of something like a standard little bee, bzzz type bee. That little insect has exactly the same kind of brain cells as we do, arranged slightly differently, but it's only got a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand. Now think, with those few brain cells, of all the incredible things a bee can do.
And they're all tiny brain cells too, I imagine.
Yeah. Well, they're basically the same size as ours, except, of course, not the longer ones that we have. So, I mean, think what a bee can do.
Make honey.
Yeah. It can build. It's an architect.
Yep. Fly.
Fly. It certainly can fly. It can fight.
Organise.
Navigate.
Yes. Defend.
It can smell.
Measure.
See.
Walk.
Unbelievable array of things. I mean, one could sit here and fill up the rest of the tape on all the things a bee can do.
It's actually infinite.
Yes.
Absolutely infinite.
Just extraordinary number of things with a few little brain cells. Now, if the bee can do all those things, imagine what really we could do with ours if we learn how to use them. And just to give you some picture of the astounding complexity and beauty of what goes on in the brain, between the brain cells, as every human on the planet kind of talks and walks and sits and thinks and daydreams and has cups of tea and eats and everything that they do.